The iron pot bubbled over the kitchen fire as Ezra Blackwood stirred the evening stew with hands that had once held scalpels steady through cannon fire. Steam rose from the thick broth, carrying the scent of wild onions and prairie herbs through the cramped boarding house kitchen. His weathered fingers, marked with old scars that spoke of a surgeon's precision, moved the wooden ladle in slow circles while his pale gray eyes watched the doorway for the evening's guests. At 68 years old, Ezra had found peace in this simple rhythm. The boarding house sat on the edge of Copper Falls, a town that had sprouted around the mining claims like wildflowers after rain. Travelers needed food and shelter, and Ezra provided both without questions or judgment. His gray beard, streaked with white like winter frost, covered the lower half of a face that had seen too much death and learned to value every breath of life. Before you find out how this story unfolds, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me what country or state you're watching from. These tales of hidden strength seem to resonate everywhere, and I'm curious how far they travel. Now, let me tell you about the night that changed everything. The kitchen door swung open with enough force to rattle the dishes stacked on the rough wooden shelves. Vance Murdoch filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his bulk blocking out the lamplight from the dining room beyond. Behind him pressed 4 other men, each one carrying the swagger and smell of trouble that Ezra had learned to recognize during his years patching up soldiers and lawmen. Murdoch's voice boomed across the small kitchen as he surveyed the humble surroundings with obvious disdain. "We want rooms, and we want food, old man. And we want them now." Ezra continued stirring the stew, his movements unchanged by the intrusion. "The rooms are $2 each, meals included. Stew will be ready in 10 minutes. You can wash up at the basin by the door." The gang leader's laugh was harsh as winter wind. $2? For this flea trap? You're lucky we don't take what we want and burn the rest." From the dining room came the sound of chair legs scraping against floorboards and the nervous murmur of other guests. Ezra recognized the voices of Martha Henley, a widow traveling with her fevered son to Sacramento, and old Pete Collins, a prospector who paid his bill in silver dust every month. Good people who deserved better than to share their shelter with wolves. Murdoch stepped closer to the stove, close enough that Ezra could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel gleam in his bloodshot eyes. His men spread out behind him like vultures settling around carrion. The biggest one, a scarred brute with hands like ham hocks, knocked over Ezra's neat stack of clean bowls. The ceramic shattered against the floor with sharp cracks that made the old cook's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Clumsy of me," the big man said with a grin that showed missing teeth. "Hope the old fool doesn't expect us to pay for those." Ezra set down his ladle and began collecting the broken pieces with the same steady care he'd once used to remove shrapnel from wounded soldiers. His pale eyes never left his task, but something in his stillness made the kitchen feel smaller and more dangerous. "You'll find clean bowls in the cupboard," he said quietly. "Food will be served at 6. Murdoch studied Ezra's bent form with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up prey. "Look at those hands, boys. Steady as a rock. Bet this old buzzard was something once upon a time." The leader reached out and grabbed Ezra's wrist, turning it to examine the long white scars that crisscrossed the back of his hand. "Knife work," he observed with professional interest. "But these cuts are too clean, too precise. Almost like." Ezra gently but firmly pulled his hand free and returned to gathering the ceramic fragments. "Kitchen accidents," he said simply. "Hot pots and sharp knives don't forgive careless moments." From the dining room came the sound of young Timothy Henley's coughing, a wet rattling that spoke of fever and congestion. Martha's voice followed, soft and worried as she tried to comfort her sick boy. The sound made something flicker behind Ezra's calm exterior, a shadow of memory that passed like clouds across still water. Murdoch heard it too, and his grin widened with malicious inspiration. "Sick kid, huh? Shame if something happened to make him worse. Food poisoning can be terrible dangerous for little ones." The old cook's hands paused in their gathering for just a heartbeat, but when he looked up his expression remained as placid as ever. "The stew is made fresh every day with clean water and good meat. No one gets sick in my kitchen. We'll see about that, old man." Murdoch's voice carried a promise that made his men chuckle like hyenas. Sometimes accidents happen, even in the most careful kitchens. Ezra stood slowly, his joints creaking like old leather, and deposited the broken ceramic in the waste bucket beside the stove. He moved with the deliberate care of age, but there was something underneath that careful motion, a precision that spoke of muscle memory carved deep by years of practice. "I'll have your rooms ready in a few minutes," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Supper at 6, like I said." The gang filtered out to terrorize the other guests, but Murdoch lingered in the doorway like a bad omen. His eyes stayed fixed on Ezra's hands as the old cook returned to his stirring. "You know what I think, old-timer? I think you're hiding something under all that humble cook nonsense. But don't worry. Before we leave this dump, I'm going to find out exactly what kind of man you really are." The kitchen door swung shut, leaving Ezra alone with the bubbling stew and the weight of memories that pressed against his chest like old wounds. He reached beneath his apron and touched the small leather roll hidden there, feeling the familiar shape of instruments that had saved more lives than he could count. But tonight, he suspected, those same tools might be called upon for a very different kind of surgery. 6 o'clock arrived with the punctuality that Ezra Blackwood had maintained for the past 3 years. The boarding house dining room filled with the clatter of spoons against bowls and the quiet conversations of travelers grateful for hot food after long days on dusty trails. Martha Henley sat beside young Timothy, encouraging the pale boy to eat despite his persistent cough. Old Pete Collins hunched over his portion with the focused attention of a man who had learned not to waste good meals during lean times. Murdoch and his gang occupied the corner table like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue. They ate with the loud enthusiasm of men who took what they wanted and cared nothing for the comfort of others. Their crude jokes and harsh laughter dominated the room, making the other guests shift nervously in their chairs and speak in whispers. Ezra served each bowl with the same careful attention, his weathered hands steady despite the tension that filled the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. He noticed how Martha kept glancing toward the gang's table, her protective instincts clearly on edge. Timothy's coughing had worsened throughout the day, and the boy barely touched his food despite his mother's gentle coaxing. The stew was Ezra's finest work, rich with tender beef and vegetables that had simmered for hours until they melted on the tongue. Wild herbs gathered from the hillsides added layers of flavor that reminded travelers of home cooking and better times. Steam rose from each bowl carrying the promise of warmth and satisfaction, exactly the kind of meal that made the boarding house's reputation worth the $2 fee. As the evening progressed, Ezra retreated to the kitchen to begin cleaning the massive iron pot and preparing tomorrow's bread. The routine calmed his nerves and helped him forget the calculating look in Murdoch's eyes. His hands worked automatically, scrubbing and rinsing with the methodical precision that had once made him the finest field surgeon in Sherman's army. Through the kitchen door, he could hear the continuing sounds of the dinner crowd. Conversations had grown more relaxed as the gang's attention focused on their food rather than intimidating fellow guests. Perhaps, Ezra thought, they would simply eat and sleep and move on without causing the trouble his instincts warned him to expect. But old instincts, carved deep by years of reading men's intentions across operating tables and battlefield camps, rarely steered him wrong. Something felt wrong about the sudden quiet from Murdoch's table, a stillness that reminded him of the moment before artillery shells began falling. The first scream came 20 minutes after Ezra had finished washing the pot. Martha's voice cracked across the dining room like a whip, high and desperate with the kind of terror that only a mother watching her child suffer could produce. "Timothy," she cried. "Timothy, what's wrong?" Ezra dropped his dish towel and rushed through the swinging door to find chaos replacing the peaceful dinner scene. Timothy Henley convulsed in his chair, his small body racked with spasms that bent him nearly double. Foam flecked his lips and his eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, giving his young face the terrible mask of approaching death. But Timothy was not alone in his agony. Old Pete Collins had collapsed beside his overturned chair, his weathered hands clawing at his throat as if trying to tear away invisible fingers that choked off his breath. Near the window, a traveling merchant named Davies writhed on the floor, his expensive suit soaked with sweat and vomit. The dining room erupted in panic. Chairs overturned as guests scrambled away from the stricken victims, some running for the door while others pressed against the walls in terrified confusion. Only Murdoch and his gang remained seated, their faces showing what might have been shock, but looked suspiciously like poorly concealed satisfaction. "What did you put in that stew, old man?" Murdoch's voice boomed over the chaos with theatrical outrage. "You've poisoned these poor folks with your careless cooking." Ezra ignored the accusation and dropped to his knees beside Timothy, his trained eyes taking in symptoms with the rapid assessment that had once saved lives in field hospitals where seconds meant the difference between living and dying. The boy's pupils were dilated despite the bright lamplight. His pulse, when Ezra checked it with fingers that moved with automatic precision, was rapid and irregular. The convulsions followed a pattern that spoke of neurological disruption, while the excessive salivation and difficulty breathing pointed toward a specific family of toxins. Martha clutched at Ezra's sleeve with desperate hands. "Help him," she begged. "Please, you have to help him." The old cook's mind shifted into a mode he had not accessed for years, the cold analytical state that allowed battlefield surgeons to work while cannons roared and men screamed around them. He examined each victim in turn, noting the consistency of symptoms while his hands checked pulses, pupils, and reflexes with movements too quick and professional for a simple boarding house cook. Pete Collins grabbed Ezra's wrist with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "Feels like fire in my chest." Murdoch rose from his table with elaborate concern painted across his brutal features. "Look what your poison slop has done, cook. These people are dying because of your carelessness." The gang leader's men nodded in agreement, their performance convincing enough to fool anyone who had not spent years reading the subtle tales of deception across poker tables and interrogation rooms. But Ezra saw the glances they exchanged when they thought no one was watching, the barely suppressed grins that flickered at the corners of their mouths. This was not food poisoning, and it certainly was not carelessness. Someone had introduced a specific toxin into the stew after Ezra had finished cooking it, something that would cause exactly these symptoms in exactly this time frame. His mind cataloged the possibilities with clinical detachment while his hands continued their examination of the victims. Oleander, he thought. Most likely oleander extract, which would explain the cardiac irregularities combined with neurological symptoms. A poison favored by those who wanted to cause suffering rather than quick death, and one that required specific knowledge to identify and treat. "The nearest doctor is 3 days' ride," Martha sobbed. "They'll all be dead by then." Murdoch shrugged with callous indifference. "Shame about that. Guess this old fool will have to live with knowing his bad cooking killed innocent folks." Ezra stood slowly, his pale gray eyes meeting Murdoch's gaze with an intensity that made the gang leader's theatrical concern falter for just a moment. The victims needed immediate treatment, and there was no time to send for help that would arrive too late to matter. "I'll need clean water," he said quietly. "Lots of it. And charcoal from the stove. Also salt, as much as you can find." Martha stared at him through her tears. "Do you know something about doctoring?" "A little," Ezra replied, already moving toward his kitchen with the swift efficiency of a man who had made life and death decisions under pressure more times than he cared to remember. Murdoch's voice followed him through the swinging door, heavy with suspicion that had not been part of his earlier performance. "Just how much do you know about doctoring, old man? Seems mighty convenient that you know exactly what to do for poisoning." Ezra paused in the doorway, his weathered hands steady on the frame despite the chaos behind him. "When you've cooked for as many travelers as I have, you learn to recognize bad food and how to treat it." But even as he spoke, his mind was already calculating dosages and treatment protocols that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with the medical training that had made him legendary among Union Army field surgeons. The leather roll of instruments hidden beneath his apron seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if the tools themselves remembered their true purpose. "Some mistakes can't be undone," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that made Murdoch's confident grin fade into something more uncertain. The gang leader's laugh was forced and hollow. "Is that a threat, cook?" Ezra turned back toward the kitchen without answering, but his silence carried more menace than any threat could have delivered. Behind him, Timothy Henley's convulsions grew stronger, and Martha's sobs filled the boarding house like the sound of approaching judgment. In the kitchen, Ezra's hands moved with the swift precision of remembered training as he gathered the materials needed to save lives. But part of his mind, The part that had been honed by years of battlefield medicine and hard decisions was already planning for the moment when saving lives might require taking them. The game had begun, and Murdoch had no idea that he was facing an opponent who understood both healing and killing with equal expertise. The boarding house transformed into a field hospital as Ezra Blackwood worked through the long night with hands that remembered every lesson learned in Army medical tents. He moved between the three victims with the fluid efficiency of a man who had once treated dozens of wounded soldiers while artillery shells exploded overhead. Each step was calculated, each movement precise, as if some invisible choreographer guided his actions according to protocols burned into memory by years of desperate practice. Timothy Henley lay on a makeshift bed of dining room chairs pushed together, his small body still racked by intermittent spasms that made his mother sob with helpless terror. Ezra knelt beside the boy and lifted his eyelids with fingers that probed with clinical gentleness, studying the dilation of pupils under lamplight with the focused intensity of a man reading vital signs. Oleander poisoning, he murmured to himself, confirming what his initial assessment had suggested. The cardiac glycosides were disrupting the boy's heartbeat, while the neurological toxins caused the convulsions. Without proper treatment, Timothy would be dead before dawn, his small heart simply stopping like a clock that had run down. But Ezra knew exactly which clock mechanisms needed winding, and his hands moved with the steady precision of a master craftsman as he began the delicate work of saving a life. He mixed activated charcoal with water in precise ratios that had nothing to do with folk remedies and everything to do with advanced toxicology training. The black mixture looked like something a frontier cook might concoct, but the dosage calculations running through Ezra's mind belonged to a physician who had studied under the finest medical minds of his generation. Martha watched with desperate hope as Ezra administered the charcoal mixture to her son, supporting the boy's head with one hand while carefully controlling the flow with the other. His movements carried the confidence of experience, the sure touch of someone who had performed this exact procedure countless times under far worse conditions. Old Pete Collins lay nearby, his weathered face gray with pain and his breathing shallow as the poison worked through his system. Ezra moved to him next, his examination swift but thorough as he checked pulse points and listened to heartbeat with an ear pressed close to the prospector's chest. The rhythm was irregular but not yet critical, giving them time to work if they acted quickly enough. The traveling merchant Davies was the worst affected, his body convulsing so violently that Ezra had to physically restrain him to prevent injury. The old cook's hands gripped the man's shoulders with surprising strength, holding him steady while calculating dosages for a patient nearly twice Timothy's weight. As Ezra worked, his mind slipped briefly into memories that belonged to a different man in a different time. Canvas walls stained with blood and gunpowder smoke. The screams of wounded soldiers carried on stretchers from battlefields where brother fought brother with a savagery that defied comprehension. His own voice, younger then but carrying the same calm authority, directing orderlies and assistants through procedures that separated the living from the dying. The field hospital at Antidote had been hell given physical form, a place where men arrived as broken dolls and left either whole or wrapped in canvas shrouds. Ezra remembered the weight of responsibility that came with each decision, the terrible mathematics of battlefield triage where one man's life might be sacrificed to save three others. His hands had been steadier then, unmarked by age but already scarred by the endless parade of suffering that defined a military surgeon's existence. A gentle knock on the boarding house door pulled Ezra back from memories that tasted of copper and regret. Deputy Marshal Jake Thornton stepped into the dining room, his young face creased with concern as he surveyed the scene of improvised medical care. Jake was barely 25 years old, earnest and dedicated, but still learning the hard lessons that came with wearing a badge in frontier territory. Doc Peterson sent me to check on the report of food poisoning, Jake said quietly, removing his hat with automatic courtesy despite the crisis unfolding before him. Heard there were folks taken sick after supper. Ezra continued his work without looking up, his hands busy preparing a second dose of activated charcoal for Pete Collins. The nearest doctor is 3 days away, and these people can't wait that long. The young deputy moved closer, watching with growing amazement as Ezra performed procedures that spoke of formal medical training rather than frontier improvisation. The old cook's movements were too precise, too confident, displaying a level of expertise that seemed impossible for a simple boarding house operator. "Where did you learn to do all this?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion mixed with genuine curiosity. Ezra glanced up briefly, his pale gray eyes meeting the deputy's gaze with steady calm. "You pick things up over the years. Frontier living teaches a man to handle medical emergencies whether he wants to or not." But Jake was studying Ezra's technique with the focused attention of someone who had grown up listening to his grandfather's war stories. The old deputy who had trained Jake used to describe watching army surgeons work in field hospitals, and the procedures he was witnessing matched those descriptions with startling accuracy. "The way you're checking his pulse," Jake said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The method you used to examine his pupils. My grandfather described watching surgeons work exactly like that during the war." Ezra's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work, but something shifted in his expression. The mask of simple competence slipped slightly, revealing depths of knowledge and experience that belonged to someone far more significant than a frontier cook. Jake stepped closer, his eyes wide with growing recognition. He was a student of military history, fascinated by the legends and heroes who had emerged from the chaos of civil war. His grandfather had served under Sherman and told stories of legendary medical officers who had saved thousands of lives through skill and dedication that bordered on the miraculous. "Doc Ezra Blackwood," Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "The ghost surgeon of Antidote. The man who operated for 72 hours straight while the battle raged around him." The boarding house dining room fell silent except for the labored breathing of the three victims and the soft crackle of lamplight. Martha looked up from her son's bedside, her tear-stained face reflecting confusion at the deputy's words. Even Murdoch and his gang, who had been watching from the corner with carefully neutral expressions, leaned forward with sudden interest. Ezra continued working, but his movements had taken on a different quality. The careful disguise of age and frailty fell away like a discarded coat, revealing the true nature of the man beneath. His posture straightened slightly, his hands moved with even greater precision, and his eyes carried the cold certainty of someone who had faced death countless times and refused to yield. "That man died on a battlefield 20 years ago," Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying a winter chill that made several people shiver despite the warm room. "I'm just a cook who's trying to save some lives." But Jake knew better, and his whispered words carried the weight of historical fact. 200 successful battlefield amputations with 0 fatalities from infection saved more Union soldiers than any other field surgeon in Sherman's army. They say you could remove a musket ball from a man's heart and have him walking within a week. Ezra lifted Timothy's eyelid again, checking pupil response with movements that belonged to a master of medical science rather than a frontier cook. Under his expert care, the boy's convulsions had already begun to subside. The activated charcoal was binding the toxins in his system, while carefully administered fluids helped his kidneys process the remaining poison. Old Pete Collins stirred on his improvised bed, his breathing deeper and more regular than it had been since the poisoning began. The merchant Davies had stopped convulsing entirely, his body finally relaxing as the antidote protocols took effect. 3 men who should have died were going to live, saved by knowledge and skill that belonged to a legend most people believed was long dead. Murdoch watched from his corner table with growing alarm as his carefully planned poisoning unraveled before his eyes. The old cook was not supposed to possess the expertise necessary to identify and treat oleander poisoning. The victims were supposed to die slowly and painfully, creating chaos that would allow the gang to rob the other guests and disappear into the night. Instead, he found himself facing someone whose medical knowledge made a mockery of his crude attempt at murder. Worse, the deputy's recognition meant that their humble target might be someone far more dangerous than anticipated. "Surgery's done," Ezra said quietly as he checked Timothy's pulse one final time. The boy's heartbeat was strong and regular now, his color returning as the poison lost its grip on his small body. "Now comes the hard part." He stood slowly, his weathered hands steady despite the long night's work. Martha reached out to grasp his fingers, tears of gratitude streaming down her face as she realized her son would live. But Ezra's attention had shifted to Murdoch's table, where four men sat with expressions that mixed fear with desperate calculation. The ghost surgeon of Antietam had returned from the dead, and his pale gray eyes held the cold promise of justice that had once made Confederate soldiers flee rather than face the legendary doctor who could heal with one hand while killing with the other. The game had changed completely, and everyone in the room knew that the real confrontation was about to begin. Murdoch's crude attempt at poisoning innocent people had awakened something that had been sleeping quietly for 20 years, and now that legendary skill would be turned toward a very different kind of surgery. The kind that removed cancers from the body of civilization with the same precision once used to extract bullets from wounded soldiers. The healing was finished. The cutting was about to begin. The boarding house dining room held its breath as Murdoch rose from his corner table like a thundercloud gathering for a storm. His face had gone pale beneath the stubble and grime, but his eyes burned with the desperate rage of a man watching his carefully laid plans crumble into dust. The poisoning should have worked. The old cook should have been helpless. Instead, he faced someone whose reputation belonged in history books rather than frontier boarding houses. "You're telling me this broken-down old fool is some kind of war hero?" Murdoch's voice carried a note of forced mockery that failed to hide his growing unease. "That's the biggest load of horse manure I've heard since my last poker game." Deputy Jake Thornton stood straighter, his young face set with the kind of determination that came from facing down bullies who threatened everything decent folks tried to build. "My grandfather served in the 15th Corps under Sherman. He was there at Antietam when Doc Blackwood operated for 3 straight days without rest. Saved more lives than any 10 regular doctors could have managed." Ezra moved with deliberate calm toward his kitchen, but his path took him closer to Murdoch's table rather than away from it. The careful shuffle of an elderly cook had vanished, replaced by the measured stride of someone who approached every situation with tactical awareness burned deep by years of battlefield experience. "Stories and legends," Murdoch spat, but his gang members were shifting nervously in their chairs. "Half these war tales get made up by old men who want to sound important. I bet this fraud can't prove a damn thing he claims." The challenge hung in the air like gunsmoke while Ezra considered his response. Martha Henley still knelt beside her recovering son, watching the confrontation unfold with the fearful fascination of someone witnessing forces beyond her understanding. Old Pete Collins had propped himself up on one elbow, his weathered face alert despite the lingering effects of the poison he had barely survived. "Proof," Ezra said quietly, his pale gray eyes fixing on Murdoch with the intensity of winter ice. "You want proof?" He reached beneath his worn apron and withdrew a leather roll that had been hidden against his body for years. The leather was old but well-maintained, supple with careful oiling and unmarked by the rough handling that frontier tools typically endured. His fingers worked the ties with the automatic precision of someone who had performed this action thousands of times under conditions ranging from battlefield chaos to quiet hospital wards. The roll unfolded to reveal surgical instruments that gleamed like captured starlight despite their obvious age. Scalpels with edges so sharp they seemed to cut the lamplight itself. Bone saws with teeth precisely set for maximum efficiency. Forceps and retractors arranged in perfect order according to a system that spoke of professional medical training rather than frontier improvisation. Each instrument was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, forged by the finest medical supply houses of Baltimore and Philadelphia for physicians who demanded perfection. But more than their quality, it was their condition that marked them as belonging to someone extraordinary. After 20 years of storage, they remained sharp enough for surgery, clean enough for operating room use, maintained with a devotion that bordered on religious reverence. Murdoch stared at the instruments with growing alarm. The crude frontier bully who had planned to rob and terrorize helpless travelers found himself facing evidence of expertise that belonged to someone far more dangerous than anticipated. These were not the tools of a simple cook or even a frontier doctor. They were the instruments of a master surgeon, maintained by someone who understood their true value. 200 battlefield amputations, Jake continued, his voice filled with the kind of awe reserved for living legends. 0 deaths from infection because Doc Blackwood insisted on cleanliness standards that other surgeons thought were crazy. He taught surgical techniques that medical schools still use today. Ezra selected a scalpel from the roll with movements that belonged to ceremony rather than casual demonstration. The blade caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp fragments that danced across the dining room walls. His grip on the handle was perfect, displaying the muscle memory of someone who had once wielded such tools with life and death precision. Johns Hopkins University, he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of unshakable fact. Professor of Advanced Surgical Techniques from 1858 until the war called in 61. Trained more military surgeons than any other institution in the country. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox, my students were treating wounded on both sides of the conflict. The room fell silent except for the soft breathing of recovering poison victims and the whispered prayers of Martha Henley as she realized the true nature of the man who had saved her son. Even Murdoch's gang members seemed frozen by the weight of revelation, their crude confidence shaken by evidence they could not dismiss or ignore. But Murdoch himself was trapped by his own momentum, his pride and desperation driving him toward a confrontation he no longer wanted but could not avoid. The poisoning had been meant to create chaos and provide cover for robbery. Instead, it had unmasked someone whose very existence threatened everything the gang represented. "I don't care if you're God himself," Murdoch snarled, his hand dropping toward the Colt Navy revolver holstered at his hip. "All I see is an old man with fancy knives who thinks he's better than everyone else." The movement was fast by frontier standards, the practiced draw of someone who had used intimidation and violence to take what he wanted for most of his adult life. But speed built on bullying and brutality was no match for precision honed by years of life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Ezra's hand moved with surgical exactness, the scalpel leaving his grip in an arc so perfect it seemed choreographed by mathematics rather than human reflexes. The blade traveled exactly 18 inches through air that seemed thick as molasses, covering the distance between surgeon and target in the time it took Murdoch's fingers to close around his gun's grip. Steel met flesh with the whisper-soft precision of a master craftsman making a calculated incision. The scalpel severed tendons in Murdoch's gun hand with surgical accuracy, cutting through the flexor digitorum profundus and superficialis in a single stroke that left the fingers unable to maintain their grip on anything heavier than a feather. Murdoch's scream filled the boarding house dining room as his Colt Navy revolver clattered uselessly to the floor. His hand opened and closed like a broken puppet's appendage, the fingers twitching spasmodically as severed connections tried desperately to complete circuits that no longer existed. Severed flexor digitorum, Ezra observed with clinical detachment as he selected another instrument from his leather roll. Permanent damage to the deep digital flexors. You'll never hold a gun properly again, assuming you live long enough for the hand to heal. The other gang members sat frozen in their chairs, hands halfway to their own weapons as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The old cook had thrown a surgical instrument with the kind of precision that belonged in medical textbooks rather than barroom fights. Their leader, the man they had followed because of his reputation for violence and intimidation, had been crippled in less than 2 seconds by someone who moved like a force of nature. "I know exactly where every artery runs in the human body," Ezra continued, his voice carrying the cold certainty of absolute knowledge. "The carotid that feeds your brain, the femoral that supplies your leg, the subclavian that keeps your arm alive. I can reach any of them from here with tools designed for precision work." He held up a longer instrument, something that might have been a probe or a very thin blade, letting the lamplight play along its gleaming surface. 20 years ago, I used these instruments to save lives. Tonight, I'm prepared to use them to protect innocent people from predators who think violence makes them strong. Deputy Jake Thornton had his own weapon drawn now, but his hands shook slightly as he tried to comprehend the transformation he was witnessing. The humble boarding house cook had vanished entirely, replaced by someone whose reputation belonged in legend rather than reality. The ghost surgeon of Antidote stood revealed in all his terrible competence, and Jake understood that he was witnessing history in the making. Murdoch clutched his ruined hand against his chest, blood seeping between his fingers as he stared at Ezra with eyes wide with pain and dawning terror. The man he had planned to rob and humiliate had just demonstrated surgical skill that made mockery of every crude threat and violent boast the gang leader had ever made. "You're insane," Murdoch gasped through gritted teeth. "You can't just attack people with medical instruments." Ezra's pale gray eyes held no emotion beyond the cold assessment of a professional evaluating a problem that required systematic solution. "Self-defense," he replied quietly. "You drew a weapon with intent to commit violence. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat while minimizing long-term damage. In any court of law, that would be considered both justified and restrained." The surgical precision of his language matched the mechanical exactness with which he had disabled Murdoch's gun hand. This was not random violence or frontier justice. It was the calculated response of someone who understood human anatomy with such completeness that he could inflict precise damage without risking unintended consequences. Martha Henley watched with her son cradled in her arms, torn between gratitude for their salvation and horror at the clinical efficiency with which their protector had maimed another human being. Old Pete Collins nodded with grim satisfaction, recognizing justice being served by someone competent enough to ensure it was delivered properly. The 3 remaining gang members faced a choice that would define whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. They could draw their weapons and face someone whose surgical precision made mockery of their crude shooting skills. Or they could surrender to a man whose reputation was built on healing rather than killing, hoping that his medical oath might stay his hand long enough for mercy to prevail. Ezra cleaned the scalpel with a cloth from his apron, his movements carrying the automatic care of someone who maintained his tools according to standards that never varied. The blade gleamed once again, ready for whatever surgical procedure might be required next. The ghost surgeon of Antidote had returned to active duty, and his first operation had been a complete success. Murdoch would never hold a gun again, but he would live to stand trial for attempted murder. The other gang members still had the opportunity to surrender peacefully and avoid learning firsthand why battlefield surgeons understood death with such intimate precision. The choice was theirs, but time was running short. Ezra had more surgery to perform before the night was over, and his instruments were ready for whatever procedures justice might require. The 3 remaining gang members exchanged desperate glances as their leader writhed on the floor, clutching his ruined hand against his chest like a broken bird. Blood seeped between Murdoch's fingers in steady drops that marked time like a crimson metronome, each splash against the wooden floor counting down moments until they would have to choose between surrender and facing the legendary surgeon whose instruments had just proven deadlier than any conventional weapon. The scarred brute who had smashed Ezra's bowls earlier rose slowly from his chair, his ham-sized hands moving toward the pair of Remington revolvers holstered across his massive chest. Bull Morrison had killed 17 men in various frontier towns, building his reputation on brute strength and the kind of savage violence that made decent folks cross streets rather than meet his eyes. But he had never faced someone who understood human anatomy with such scientific precision that every movement could be calculated to cause maximum effect with minimum effort. "You got lucky with Vance," Morrison growled, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "But tricks don't work twice, and there's 3 of us left to 1 of you." Ezra selected another instrument from his leather roll, this one longer and thinner than the scalpel he had used to disable Murdoch. The probe gleamed with surgical sharpness, designed for exploring bullet wounds and removing foreign objects from damaged tissue. In the right hands, it could navigate the human body's complex geography with the precision of a master cartographer mapping unexplored territory. "The mathematics are actually in my favor," Ezra observed with clinical calm. 3 targets, each with specific vulnerabilities that can be addressed using techniques developed over 20 years of battlefield medicine. "Would you like me to explain the anatomical structures I'll be targeting, or would you prefer to surrender while you're still physically capable of walking to the jail?" Deputy Jake Thornton had positioned himself near the boarding house entrance, his revolver drawn but his hands trembling slightly as he tried to reconcile the legend his grandfather had described with the reality unfolding before his eyes. The stories had always emphasized Doc Blackwood's healing skills, his ability to save lives under impossible conditions. They had never mentioned that the same knowledge could be turned toward more lethal purposes. The youngest gang member, a wiry kid named Santos who couldn't have been more than 19, was already backing toward the window with sweat beading on his forehead like morning dew. His experience with violence was limited to intimidating shopkeepers and robbing drunken miners, not facing someone whose reputation belonged in medical journals and military histories. But Morrison had built his identity on violence and intimidation, and retreat was not a concept his simple mind could process. He drew both Remingtons in a movement that had served him well in a dozen previous confrontations, the heavy revolvers clearing leather with practiced speed as his finger found the triggers. Ezra moved like flowing water between Morrison's gun barrels, his body shifting with the fluid grace of someone who had dodged musket balls and artillery fragments during battles where hesitation meant death. The probe in his hand traced an arc through lamplight, moving with mathematical precision toward a target located exactly 3 inches below Morrison's left ear. The instrument penetrated skin and muscle with surgical exactness, sliding between anatomical structures to reach the vagus nerve cluster that controlled blood pressure and heart rhythm. Ezra's knowledge of pressure points came not from martial arts training, but from medical textbooks that mapped every neural pathway in exquisite detail. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply and precisely where to apply it for maximum effect. Morrison's guns discharged toward the ceiling as his nervous system misfired like a broken telegraph line. His massive body convulsed once before collapsing to the floor, not dead, but completely incapacitated as disrupted nerve signals left him unable to coordinate voluntary movement. The Remingtons clattered away across wooden planks as his fingers lost all sensation below the wrists. Temporary paralysis of the brachial plexus, Ezra explained to the remaining gang members with the dispassionate tone he had once used to instruct medical students. Complete loss of motor function in both arms for approximately 6 hours, followed by gradual recovery, assuming no permanent damage to surrounding tissue. Santos stared at his fallen companion with eyes wide as saucers, his own weapon only halfway clear of its holster as he tried to process what he had just witnessed. The old cook had disabled a man twice his size using what appeared to be a thin piece of metal, demonstrating anatomical knowledge that seemed more like magic than medicine. The third gang member, a grizzled outlaw named Reeves who had survived 15 years of frontier violence through cunning rather than courage, was already raising his hands in surrender. He had heard enough stories about the war to recognize, when he was facing someone whose skills operated on a completely different level than common criminality. "I'm out," Reeves announced with the practical wisdom of someone who preferred living to dying for stupid reasons. "This ain't worth getting carved up by some kind of surgical wizard." But Santos was young and stupid and terrified, a dangerous combination that drove him to complete his draw despite every instinct screaming for him to run. His Colt cleared leather with the desperate speed of panic, the hammer coming back as his fingers sought the trigger that would send lead toward the legendary figure who had materialized from what should have been an easy robbery. Ezra's second probe moved with the same surgical precision as the first, but this time he targeted the ulnar nerve at Santos's elbow, the vulnerable spot where the funny bone created a direct pathway to nervous system disruption. The instrument slipped between skin and muscle with barely a whisper of steel against flesh, finding its target with the kind of accuracy that came from years of locating damaged nerves in battlefield conditions. Santos's gun dropped from suddenly nerveless fingers as electrical fire raced up his arm, the pain so precise and overwhelming that his vision grayed at the edges. He clutched his elbow and sank to his knees, his face twisted with agony that felt like lightning trapped beneath his skin. Ulnar nerve disruption, Ezra noted with clinical satisfaction. Temporary, but extremely painful. The sensation should subside in approximately 30 minutes, assuming he doesn't require further treatment. From the floor, Murdoch watched his gang's destruction with the growing horror of someone realizing that his carefully planned robbery had transformed into something approaching a medical demonstration. The old cook was systematically dismantling his men with techniques that belonged in surgery textbooks rather than frontier gunfights. "I took an oath to do no harm," Ezra said quietly, his pale gray eyes reflecting the lamplight like winter ice as he surveyed the 3 disabled gang members. But I also swore to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon the defenseless. Sometimes those obligations come into conflict, and a man must choose which oath takes precedence. He moved toward his kitchen, but paused at the swinging door to address Deputy Jake Thornton. You'll want to get Doc Peterson here as soon as possible to treat their injuries properly. My field medicine will keep them stable, but they'll need professional care to avoid complications. Jake nodded numbly, still trying to process the casual efficiency with which the legendary surgeon had disabled 4 armed men without causing permanent damage. The ghost surgeon of Antidote had lived up to every story his grandfather had ever told, but the reality was far more terrifying than any legend could convey. But Murdoch was not finished fighting. Even with his gun hand ruined and his men scattered across the dining room floor like broken dolls. Desperation gave him strength as he staggered toward the fireplace, his uninjured hand closing around a burning piece of kindling that glowed like an angry star in the lamp-lit room. If I can't have what I came for, then nobody gets anything, he snarled, raising the burning wood toward the canvas ceiling that would ignite like dry paper. This whole place burns, and everyone dies in the fire. How's that for justice, Doc? The threat hung in the air like smoke as Murdoch swayed near the fireplace, his blood loss making him unsteady, but his desperation providing enough strength to carry out his final act of spite. Martha Henley clutched her recovering son closer, realizing that escape from poison might mean nothing if they all burned to death in a blazing building. But Ezra had spent too many years making life and death calculations under pressure to be rattled by the crude threats of a wounded criminal. He selected his finest scalpel from the leather roll, weighing it in his palm like a perfectly balanced throwing knife, while his mind calculated angles and distances with the precision of an artillery officer. I can save any life, he said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had proven that statement hundreds of times under battlefield conditions. I can also end it instantly without causing unnecessary suffering. The carotid artery is located exactly 2 inches below your left jaw. A precise cut there would result in unconsciousness within 15 seconds and death within 2 minutes. Completely painless if performed correctly. The burning kindling trembled in Murdoch's grip as he stared into pale gray eyes that held no emotion beyond professional assessment. This was not a threat or a bluff. It was a medical opinion delivered by someone whose expertise in human anatomy made him uniquely qualified to discuss the mechanics of death with scientific accuracy. The choice is yours, Ezra continued with surgical calm. Drop the fire and surrender peacefully, or learn exactly why surgeons understand both healing and killing with equal precision. But choose quickly. My arm is getting tired, and precision suffers when muscles fatigue. Murdoch looked around the dining room at his destroyed gang, at the deputy's drawn weapon, at the recovered poison victims who watched him with eyes that held no sympathy for his plight. The burning wood felt heavier with each passing second, and the old surgeon's pale gaze promised consequences that would be both swift and final. The kindling dropped from nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. Murdoch sank to his knees beside the fireplace, his ruined hand pressed against his chest while tears of pain and defeat streamed down his weathered cheeks. Please, he whispered through gritted teeth. I surrender. No more cutting. No more surgery. I'm done. Ezra moved forward with the same careful precision he had displayed throughout the confrontation, kneeling beside his defeated opponent with instruments selected for healing rather than harm. His hands worked with gentle efficiency as he examined the severed tendons in Murdoch's gun hand, applying pressure bandages with the same skill he had once used to treat battlefield wounds. The damage is reparable with proper surgery, he announced after completing his examination. You'll need a real surgeon, but function can probably be restored if the operation is performed within the next few weeks. Consider it a reminder that violence against innocent people carries consequences that last much longer than the momentary satisfaction of cruelty. One by one, he treated the injuries he had inflicted on the gang members, his medical oath compelling him to provide care even for those who had threatened the lives of people under his protection. Morrison's paralysis was already beginning to fade as the pressure on his nerve cluster decreased. Santos clutched his treated elbow with grateful bewilderment as the electrical fire in his arm subsided to manageable levels. Deputy Jake Thornton secured the prisoners with iron shackles, but his hands shook slightly as he worked. He had witnessed something that belonged in legend rather than reality. Watched the ghost surgeon of Antidote demonstrate why his reputation had survived 20 years of frontier storytelling. The boarding house dining room fell quiet except for the soft breathing of recovering patients and the whispered prayers of Martha Henley as she realized her son would live to see another sunrise. Justice had been served with surgical precision by hands that understood both healing and harm, proving that some oaths were strong enough to survive even the grave. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Ezra Blackwood still rose before dawn to tend the fire beneath his iron cooking pot. The boarding house kitchen remained his sanctuary, a place where the simple rhythm of meal preparation provided the same steady comfort it had offered for the past 3 years. But the leather roll of surgical instruments no longer stayed hidden beneath his apron. Instead, it rested openly on the kitchen table, ready for whatever emergencies might arrive with the next group of travelers seeking shelter in Copper Falls. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been cleaned and repaired after the confrontation, casting golden light across a dining room that bore no visible scars from the violence that had erupted between its walls. New bowls replaced the ones Murdoch's gang had smashed, and the floorboards showed no stains from the blood that had marked their defeat. But the people of Copper Falls remembered every detail of that night, and word had spread through the territory like wildfire across dry prairie grass. Deputy Jake Thornton had proven to be an enthusiastic storyteller, sharing the tale of the ghost surgeon's return with anyone willing to listen. His grandfather's war stories took on new significance now that Jake had witnessed the legend in person, seen surgical instruments wielded with deadly precision by hands that had once saved thousands of lives on Civil War battlefields. The young deputy's accounts grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. The most dangerous man in 3 territories was a gentle cook who would rather heal than harm. Timothy Henley ran through the boarding house corridors with the boundless energy of childhood restored, his pale cheeks now flushed with health as his young body recovered from its brush with oleander poisoning. The boy had taken to calling Ezra Doc instead of Mr. Blackwood, a title that carried more weight than any formal medical degree. Martha watched her son's recovery with tears of gratitude that still welled up whenever she saw the old surgeon stirring his daily stew. Old Pete Collins had become something of a local celebrity, regaling saloon patrons with his first-hand account of being saved by battlefield medicine while a gang of killers watched helplessly. The prospector's storytelling skills had improved considerably since his recovery, and he never failed to emphasize how Ezra's gentle hands had pulled him back from the edge of death with knowledge that belonged in medical textbooks. But perhaps the most significant change was the steady stream of injured and sick people who began arriving in Copper Falls seeking treatment from the legendary surgeon who had emerged from 20 years of peaceful obscurity. They came on horseback and in wagons, carried by family members who had heard impossible stories about miraculous healings performed in a frontier boarding house kitchen. A rancher's wife arrived with a badly set broken leg that had healed incorrectly after a fall from her horse. Ezra rebroke and properly set the bone with surgical precision, using techniques he had perfected during years of treating cavalry accidents and artillery injuries. The woman walked normally again within 6 weeks, spreading word of the miracle doctor who charged nothing more than the cost of a boarding house meal. A young cowboy brought his father, an old-timer whose war wound had become infected after decades of improper care. Ezra cleaned and treated the festering injury with the same methodical attention he had once brought to battlefield hospitals, removing dead tissue and applying modern antiseptic principles that prevented the spread of gangrene. The old soldier wept with relief as pain that had plagued him for 15 years finally subsided. Word reached the territorial capital, where medical professionals debated whether the legendary Doc Blackwood could really have survived in frontier obscurity for 2 decades. A representative from the Territorial Medical Board made the long journey to Copper Falls, expecting to find either a charlatan trading on a dead man's reputation or perhaps a broken old soldier suffering from delusions of grandeur. Instead, he found surgical skill that exceeded anything being practiced in the territory's established medical centers. Ezra demonstrated techniques that were being taught in the finest medical schools back east, procedures that had been developed through battlefield necessity and refined by years of desperate innovation under impossible conditions. The representative returned to the capital with recommendations that Ezra be offered a position as territorial chief surgeon, an offer that was politely but firmly declined. Ezra preferred the simple life he had built in Copper Falls, tending his boarding house guests and providing medical care to those who needed it most. There was peace in the routine of daily cooking, satisfaction in the knowledge that his dual skills could serve the community without the terrible pressures that had once driven him from battlefield to battlefield. The kitchen had become an informal clinic where injured travelers received treatment that rivaled anything available in major cities. Ezra's surgical instruments gleamed on the scrubbed wooden table, maintained with the same obsessive care that had once kept them ready for emergency amputations under enemy fire. But now they served life rather than the grim mathematics of battlefield triage. On a crisp autumn morning, as Ezra stirred a pot of venison stew that filled the boarding house with savory aromas, a young man appeared in the kitchen doorway with the nervous enthusiasm of someone meeting a childhood hero. Dr. William Hayes had just graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School, the same institution where Ezra had once taught advanced surgical techniques to students who went on to save countless lives throughout the war. Doc Blackwood, the young physician said with barely contained excitement, "I've traveled 800 miles to meet you. My professors still talk about your contributions to battlefield medicine, the techniques you developed that became standard practice in military hospitals." Ezra glanced up from his cooking with the gentle smile that had become familiar to anyone who shared meals at his table. "That was a long time ago, son. I'm just a cook now, trying to keep travelers fed and comfortable." But the young doctor had done his research, studying medical journals that documented innovations attributed to the ghost surgeon of Antidote. "Sir, you revolutionized trauma surgery. Your sterile techniques reduced infection rates by 70%. The suturing methods you developed are still being taught in medical schools across the country." The old surgeon continued stirring his stew with hands that had once sutured arteries, while artillery shells exploded overhead. "Those techniques came from necessity, not genius. When you're trying to save lives under impossible conditions, you learn to adapt quickly or watch good men die needlessly." Dr. Hayes moved closer, his young face earnest with the kind of dedication that Ezra remembered from his own early years in medicine. "Would you be willing to teach me? I know the theory, but I've never seen battlefield conditions. I've never had to operate while people were shooting at me or make life and death decisions when supplies were running short." Ezra studied the young physician with eyes that had evaluated countless medical students over the years. He saw genuine commitment beneath the hero worship, real dedication to the art of healing that transcended mere academic achievement. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, eager to learn and willing to sacrifice comfort for the opportunity to save lives. "Teaching is different from doing," Ezra replied thoughtfully. "Medical school gives you knowledge, but experience teaches wisdom. Out here on the frontier, every case is complicated by factors they don't discuss in textbooks. Limited supplies, primitive conditions, patients who can't afford to take weeks recovering from surgery." Over the following days, Dr. Hayes proved himself worthy of instruction. He assisted with procedures that challenged everything his formal education had taught him about proper medical practice, learning to improvise solutions using materials that would have horrified his professors. Ezra shared knowledge that belonged to hard experience rather than academic theory, techniques developed through necessity and refined by years of desperate innovation. "Heal when you can, protect when you must," Ezra told his student as they cleaned instruments after treating a miner's crushed hand. Sometimes those obligations overlap in ways that medical school never prepares you for. The same knowledge that saves lives can be used to defend the innocent from those who would harm them. Dr. Hayes absorbed every lesson with the hunger of someone who understood that he was receiving education that no university could provide. He learned to set bones using improvised splints, to suture wounds with materials that had never seen the inside of a medical supply catalog, to diagnose conditions based on symptoms that textbooks described, but frontier reality complicated. As winter approached, Ezra began preparing for the quiet season when heavy snows would limit travel and give him time to focus on the simple pleasures of cooking and maintaining his boarding house. The surgical instruments that had seen so much use during the busy months would be cleaned and stored, ready for whatever emergencies spring might bring. On the final evening before Dr. Hayes returned to his practice in Sacramento, the two physicians shared dinner in the boarding house dining room, where legend had been reborn 3 months earlier. The young doctor had filled notebooks with observations and techniques that would serve him throughout his career, knowledge that would be passed on to future generations of frontier physicians. The hardest lesson you'll learn is knowing when to put the instruments away, Ezra said as they finished their meal. Surgery is about healing, but healing requires knowing when cutting has served its purpose. The same wisdom applies to everything we do in medicine and in life. Dr. Hayes packed his notebooks with reverent care, understanding that he carried knowledge that would save lives throughout his career. Before he left, Ezra presented him with a surgical probe from his own kit, an instrument that had served on battlefields and in frontier emergencies for more than 20 years. Use this wisely, the old surgeon said as he pressed the gleaming tool into young hands that trembled with the weight of responsibility. Remember that the power to heal carries with it the obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As Dr. Hayes disappeared down the mountain trail towards Sacramento, Ezra returned to his kitchen and carefully wrapped his surgical instruments in their leather roll. The tools that had saved Timothy Henley's life and ended Murdoch's reign of terror were cleaned and oiled with the same meticulous care that had maintained them through decades of service. The ghost surgeon of Antidote had found his peace at last, serving a community that valued his gentle nature while knowing that his legendary skills remained available when justice required a surgeon's precision. In the quiet kitchen of a frontier boarding house, healing and protection had found their perfect balance. Martha Henley and her son had settled permanently in Copper Falls, where Timothy continued to recover under the watchful care of the man who had saved his life. The boy often helped in the kitchen, learning the simple lessons of hospitality and service that Ezra taught through patient example rather than formal instruction. In Timothy's bright eyes, the old surgeon could see the future of a community that had learned to value compassion over violence. If you've enjoyed this tale of hidden strength and the power of dedication to serve others, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories every week about the unsung heroes who protect and heal communities throughout history. These are tales of people who choose service over glory, who use their skills to build rather than destroy. Until next time, remember that the greatest legends are often written by those who simply refuse to turn away when others need help. The most powerful weapons are sometimes healing hands, and the strongest armor is a commitment to protect the innocent regardless of personal cost.